Our guts can handle about 60 grams per hour of glucose and about 30 grams per hour of fructose. And these are averages, right? So some people can tolerate more or less given the scenario. And fructose in itself is also can be very unique. So fructose has a higher osmolality, so it can actually bring water into the GI system quite quickly, and could also cause some GI issues. So with the big, I think, popularization in trying to eat clean foods. So some people would result on things like dates for fueling. Because the primary sugar is going to be in there as fructose, it could cause this sense of like bringing too much water into the gut, causing some GI distress.
Today, we're tackling a topic that so many runners struggle with: how to fuel properly to prevent GI distress. Whether you've experienced mid run stomach cramps, post run bloating, or the dreaded emergency bathroom stop during an important race, you know how much gut issues really can derail your performance. I'm super thrilled to introduce our guest today, Stephanie Small. Stephanie is a Toronto based sports dietitian, PhD student, and the owner of Stephanie Small Coaching. Let's get into today's discussion. Hello, Stephanie. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome. I think the first time we met actually was when you were doing the talk on carb loading at the Toronto Waterfront Marathon. Yeah. So
Yes.
we'll connect to our topic for today, which I'm very excited to chat about. Just to get started, I guess, do you want to explain a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you're working right now, and yeah, just share more about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a registered dietitian and I specialize kind of in the endurance nutrition realm. Kind of fell in love into the sports side of it about, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. And like the endurance space is just a very unique space from a nutrition perspective. So I think that's where I kind of hone in on it. There are some other areas that I work with as well, such as combat sports, which also, again, have their unique challenges. But on top of being a registered dietitian, I'm also in my PhD right now at the University of Toronto in the kinesiology program. So along with my love of nutrition, I love to research it as well. So part of my work is taking a look at nutritional interventions in clinical populations, so specifically cardiovascular disease and cancer survivors.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. When I saw you doing your PhD, private practice, and then you're also training for a full, well, you're doing a half and then a full Ironman.
Yeah.
So you should do a course on like time management as well, because that's gotta be tricky to like balance it all.
Oh, my Google Calendar is crazy, but it is my life. So
yeah, we'll have to do another episode on like training, how to balance your training with working full time.
Yes.
So actually, on that note, is that your first like full Ironman that you're training for, or?
Yeah, so I'm doing the Panama City Ironman in November, and I grew up watching it because that's where I'm from. And working with endurance athletes, I've always been inspired to do one. I just never fully committed. I've done an ultra as kind of like the furthest I've gone. But I had a client. He just was like, he kept poking me. He's like, "You can do it. You should do it." So I kind of bit the bullet this year, and yeah, I'm having fun with it so far. It's very exciting.
Awesome. Yeah. So you have about, I guess, still like 7 months or so to train.
Yeah.
And then I saw you're doing that. Is it a half Ironman?
Yeah. I'm doing the Muskoka half. So it's a hilly course. So I was told that's like a really good testament if like you can prepare yourself for a full. So I will say we'll see how that one goes. But I'm once I set a goal, I'm pretty dead set. So I'll likely still do the Panama City one no matter what.
Yeah. Awesome. I'll actually be in Huntsville that weekend. There's like a trail
nice
on the the Limberlost Challenge, which is really fun. So last year we watched on the Sunday, because we did it last year too. We watched the finishers. So I'll try to get there around the time that you might be finishing, and maybe we can show you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, there's a nice like uphill at the end, so you'll need that.
Yes, I've heard.
Yeah. I guess just getting into it a little bit more. I guess what got you interested in like sports nutrition specifically, and then working with runners and endurance athletes? Like, is that just from being endurance athlete yourself, or what sort of got you into that?
Yeah, I'm actually growing up, I was not a very athletic child. Like when people ask me if I did sports growing up, no, I was in the library studying. That's where I was at. I did not like gym class, was not athletic. But kind of in the later of my high school years, I did find running kind of like as an additional outlet, and I found that it made me feel good, those sort of things. I think at the time it was a little bit more misguided, misdirected for weight loss. And so there was that period. But as I kind of transitioned into college, I wanted to do something in healthcare, but I didn't want to be a physician. And at the time when I entered college, I've never heard of a dietitian. I grew up in a really small town, so that wasn't even like something that crossed my mind. And so I attended a intro to exercise science class, which is kind of the program everyone enters into when they want to do healthcare. And so we had a couple weeks there where we had, chiros and physios come in, but then we had a double session where someone spoke about their sports nutrition research paired with a sports dietitian, right? And so that's kind of how I ended up in both worlds because after that talk, I was like, their lives sound really amazing. It sounds
Mhm.
absolutely fascinating. So I started volunteering at the smoothie bar at the university I was at under the dietitian, and then I started volunteering in the research lab. And so it kind of really took off from there. I'm fascinated at how we metabolize energy, nutrients, and those sort of things.
Yeah, and how it can affect
Yeah.
performance and recovery and also digestion as well.
Hmm. Yes.
Today's chat. Yeah, so just to get into it, I guess why don't you take us away with sort of talking about
Yeah.
why fueling for running is so important. I know I talk about it a lot with clients too, but for everyone listening, let's just go through the basics of like why it's important and why you want to make sure that you're adequately fueling, I guess, on a regular basis, and then also fueling properly like before your runs, and then we'll get into the longer runs later as
Yeah,
well.
absolutely. Well, if we separate your nutrition from day to day nutrition with running versus kind of around workout nutrition, so you have those two buckets. Day to day nutrition, if you're not fueling adequately there, you're not only hurting your run performance, but you're also hurting yourself the rest of the day. So, from a cognitive perspective, sleep, depending on like the severity of the caloric deficit, it could be hormonal impacts, those sort of things. So, like the way you function on a day to day basis is truly impacted about how often you're fueling, what you're fueling with, and all those great things. And then on the other hand, in the other bucket, when it comes around training, that's going to be more so how you feel during the actual run. Are you feeling strong? Can you push forwards? And when you feel good when you run, those are likely when you're having the adaptation. So it's also worthwhile to have those adaptations so that running can feel good and you can continue to progress. And even if you're not racing, um, it minimizes the risk for injury and keeps that enjoyment in place with running.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And would you
Yeah.
say that applies to maybe like for someone who maybe goes out and runs like 2, 3 times a week, but it's a shorter run, 20 to 30 minutes? Is that going to be as important for someone who is maybe running like a really high mileage and they're training like 5, 6 days a week?
Yeah, I think it's still going to be as important, but the impact may not be as large, right? So if you're expending a lot more, having higher mileage, then obviously you're going to have a little bit more focus on that nutrition around your runs. If you're just going out for a 20 and 30 minutes run, jog, or for enjoyment, you still would benefit from the nutrition around there. It just, you may not have as large of a degree of impact if you didn't, right? Just because it is a shorter duration.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
And then getting into just like the fueling and setting yourself up for the run, sort of what's sort of your like takeaway, I guess, when you suggest someone fuel properly before those sessions, whether it's like a shorter run and then getting into longer runs and even like workouts or track sessions.
Yeah. At the base minimum is starting to practice having something right before. Whether you're working out at 5 a.m. or 6 p.m., having some type of simple, easily digestible carbohydrate kind of in that, 15 to 30 minutes prior to heading out the door can be extremely impactful. And I know at the end of the day, we have research to suggest, as long as your total carbohydrates are there and you had a high carb meal within 3 to 4 hours, you're likely still going to perform during that run. But it's one thing to be able to perform, but also to feel good, right? And a lot of my clients, and myself included, I find that when we run with something, on the stomach and, fresh blood glucose in the bloodstream, it just makes a difference on how you feel at the end of the run. If you're able to kind of push, if you had strides or intervals, then you're really able to maximize those efforts there as well. And then, if anything, even if it was a slow 20 to 30-minute jog, you're already ahead of the game now for that post recovery period, because you had that fuel beforehand. And by simple digestible carbohydrates, we're looking at, fruit, date, are the two biggest ones, but some of my clients also use things like honey and maple syrup are pretty popular. If you can stomach it, some toast with maybe a light spread of peanut butter or jam. So it's quite flexible. I even have some athletes that use cereal and milk if they can tolerate it.
Okay. And then I guess in terms of like the amount of carbohydrates, like the longer the run that you'll be doing when we get into like long runs, maybe you're up to 90 minutes or longer, then obviously we're going to need more carbs and probably have to start fueling a bit earlier for those runs.
Yeah, I always have a general rule of thumb of you want, 15 to 30 grams of carbohydrates before the run per hour. Again, there's some give or take there, but so if you're about to go for a 3-hour run, you would probably be better off if you fed yourself with a 60 to 75-gram carbohydrates, maybe pancakes and syrup style, versus just an applesauce, which could probably suit well for something that's 30 to 45 minutes long.
Yeah. Okay. So you don't recommend fasted running?
I do not. Well, there's research to say that, fasting can improve adaptation. That's only done in the elite performances. And when we talk about elite athletes, they really are these, I guess, unicorns per se. When we look at them metabolically, like they don't metabolize things the same just because they're able to perform at such a high cardiorespiratory capacity. We can't compare that to recreational athletes. And so, while your favorite athlete or marathon runner may be doing some fasted workouts, which actually your top 10 don't do that necessarily, it may not benefit you just because there's a difference in metabolic function just from a performance perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I guess even when it comes to minimizing like digestive distress, I know specifically fasted training when you're getting into like efforts that are more intense, like workout style runs, or getting into like your longer running where you're just like out there for longer. Fasted training specifically can, I'm sure you can speak to this as well. It's sort of like intestinal permeability cause sort of a stream like inflammatory reactions, and then we get that like natural surge of cortisol for those sessions to like fuel us, help release blood glucose. But if we do those sessions fasted, it can cause like an amplified response of cortisol, and then we can actually get more of like those GI symptoms. So especially for if someone were to maybe prioritize when they're doing fasted run, maybe it's much less impactful if they're doing, a really short, easy run first thing in the morning. But if they're doing like shorter sessions or long runs, then that's where we really don't want to get into the fasted realm. Is that correct, or would you add anything to that?
No, I think that was pretty spot on. It's funny. We actually see this in, it's mainly studied in like religious style fasting, but we see the reintroduction of food even after about a 24 to 40-hour fast. We see the influx of inflammatory cytokines, increased intestinal permeability, and those sort of things, which is interesting because, I think fasting hits this notion that it is very repair and recovery, but the transition of reintroducing foods can still be really harsh on the body. So when you're deciding to fast, if you do fast religiously, and most of the time they do encourage like slow reintroductions of foods, but doing purposeful fasting really doesn't seem to have any sort of additional benefit. As long as you're not eating for chronically 16 hours of the day, fasting is not going to have a long-term health benefit per se.
Yeah. A lot of like mixed information. I generally recommend like an overnight fast. Like I tell clients not to eat too late into the nighttime and allow like roughly like 12 hours overnight. Just we've shown that helps sort of digestive cleansing, activate, let your organs rest and repair and not focus on digestion. And then sleep is better when you're not, your body's not focusing energy on digestion. It's focusing on like repair and recovery. So, but yeah, more is not better. And especially for like elite or people who have really high training volume, trying to stuff all your food into like a small eating window is usually a recipe for disaster. So
Absolutely. And then that also can cause problems in itself as well, right? So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, yeah, and then getting into it, I guess let's talk a little bit about fueling for longer runs. So sort of walk us through when someone might want to think about intra-workout fueling or taking in,
Mhm.
forms of calories during their runs or extended sessions.
Typically, when you're starting to hit that 75-minute threshold mark, is when we really want to start considering having fuel. And some people use the 90 mark, but let's say 75 to 90-minute mark tends to be a really good rule of thumb of when you want to start introducing those carbohydrates. And that's primarily because the amount of carbohydrates that you have stored in your muscle really only lasts about 90 minutes long. And if we start to see those stored carbohydrates in the muscle go down, that's when we start to see fatigue. So when someone is bonking in a marathon or even some sort of long distance event, typically we see complete depletion of these carbohydrate stores in the muscle tissue. And in order to spare those carbohydrates, we really want to start to have fueling beforehand just to kind of preserve that and use that when we absolutely need it, but relying on those digestible, easy digestible carbohydrates during the training as well.
Hmm. So roughly 75, 90 minutes or longer, we want to think about fueling. I know that,
Mhm.
yeah, the resources online is kind of a mixed recommendation, but I guess for most athletes, you can kind of see like, how hard you're working. I think if you're maybe
Mhm.
workout within a long run, then you may stick to the
Yeah.
shorter end. If it's really slow and easy, then maybe you can get away with the 90 minutes. And then you said, did you touch on the grams of carbs per hour or generally how much you
Right.
recommend?
Yeah, I did not. So the general recommendation for up to 4 hours is going to be that 30 to 60 grams. If you are going beyond 4 hours, then that's where we start to see the recommendations jump to 60 to 90 grams per hour. And in certain populations, depending on intensities, we see some of your elite cyclists going up to 120 grams per hour. But again, they're typically cycling for 6, 7, 8 hours of the day. Now, I will say, like, when we do start to get into those events that are longer than 4 hours, ultra events and whatnot, it can get a little bit more tricky with the introduction of fat and just when total calories is a concern. But if we're focusing on mainly running at the half to full marathon um, distance, 30 to 60 grams per hour. If you are running at a higher pace and intensity, I encourage to favor closer to that 60, even tracking up to 75, depending on the type of athlete that I'm working with and what they can tolerate.
Mm-hmm. Is it true? I guess as your heart rate climbs and you're working at like a higher heart rate, your body is burning through more carbs.
Hmm.
Yeah. So if
Yeah.
you're really racing a hard marathon, you do actually need more carbs versus
Hmm.
going out for
Yeah.
a little bit of a slower effort.
Mhm.
I was actually, oh, maybe it was like a year ago. I went it was like a popular running store in Toronto, and we were
Yeah.
looking at like different gel products. And I didn't, yeah, the sales associate there was like asking us what we were looking for. And we just said we were looking for to try
Hmm.
different gels. I like experimenting with,
Yeah.
of course, nutrition products, just like so I can talk about them with clients, but looking at different gels. And I remember him asking, and I didn't disclose that I was a dietitian, but he asked like how long we were running for. And I said, long runs were about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And he actually said like, you probably don't need to be taking in anything during that because your body's like burning fat for fuel. So you really don't need to be taking in anything if you're running like slowly. So I had some things to say to that, but I'd wonder what would your
Yeah.
response be if you encountered someone saying
Yeah. I think that's a good question, and I do the same. I don't typically disclose I'm a dietitian when I'm in stores sometimes.
that?
Um, I think we it's kind of brought to the notion that utilizing fat as fuel is this like magic superpower. But in reality, that's not the case. So Dr. Louise Burke has done a phenomenal series of studies on fat adapted athletes or having a higher fat intake when it comes to more of these endurance style sports. And so when we start to metabolize fats, or that is our primary energy source because that's what's most available, and that's what would happen in this scenario if you're going to that 2 hour mark and not having anything in your run. It requires more oxygen to metabolize your fat sources. So when we see this utilization of fat sources, okay, it requires more oxygen. So now the heart is having to pump faster to get some more oxygen to the muscle tissue. And so when we have the heart beating faster, but then we also have our lungs breathing faster because it's got to keep up with that exchange of oxygen. So we see a higher heart rate, a higher perceived effort. So it feels harder, even though the effort may not be harder. Um, and we see an increased rate of fatigue. So people are typically not able to run as long at a certain intensity when they are relying mostly on fat for their primary energy source. So it is not necessarily super powered. If anything, it's going to maybe be more harmful to your runs, and it could potentially slow adaptation, right?
Mhm.
So even kind of in that post workout and recovery phase, your body, I guess, simply put, is like, okay, I use fat. We're going to create the enzyme so that we could metabolize fat. But that again is still not the most efficient way to do so. If we were to fuel with carbohydrates, your body's going to be really efficient at utilizing carbohydrates, which we know turns out to be better physiologically, keeps the heart rate lower, perception of fatigue is lower, breathing rate is lower. So physiologically, it makes sense to fuel with carbohydrates and not necessarily rely on those fats.
Yeah, exactly. Or even as we went to before, not doing it fasted because you can
Yeah.
then contribute to the risk for GI issues. I guess even like for a lot of runners too, maybe like leaner, and then we also want to try to preserve our muscle mass because that
Hmm.
run faster. So if we're
Yeah.
not taking in any fuel during the long runs, then our body's going to draw on maybe some
Hmm.
fat stores, but also like our muscle tissues.
Yeah.
Going to make us lose more muscle, which most of us don't want to do.
Right. Exactly.
Want to do everything we can to. So,
Yes.
anyways, I had that response, but I'm glad to hear you feel the same. And I guess when it comes to thinking about like GI issues, I know I've had a lot of like runners say when they do take in fuel during long runs, and then even, maybe when they're actually racing their half marathon or marathon, they experience GI issues. So
Mhm.
stool cramping, nausea, vomiting. So what would you say are maybe like some of the key mistakes people make when it comes to fueling like those extended runs in the context of like sort of setting themselves up for maybe more digestive issues, or how can they avoid GI issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I do tend to have a common view. I will say I do find most of my patients either fall in the bucket of like they can eat a full pizza before their run and they're okay, and then
Yeah.
sensitive stomachs, right? I would say one of the number one things is brushing the processed too fast, right? So we hear the recommendation of 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And so most of the time I do see individuals are like, oh, I'm going to take in 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And
Right off the bat without, yeah.
yes. If your stomach's not used to it, because it's not that you're just taking in food, but you're now taking in food and you have almost this jostling sense going around because you're running. And it could just be, I guess, a recipe for disaster. So it can sometimes result in dumping, which is when food is in the stomach and goes into the intestines too fast. And then that can cause cramping or runner's trots and those sort of things.
Mm.
So bumping up too fast tends to be something I see often. And
Mhm.
then the type of carbohydrate can be impactful as well. So we have trying not to put too much of my sciencey brain on, but we have different types of carbohydrates. So most prominently, we see glucose and fructose. Fructose, we're going to see a lot more in some of our natural sugar sources, such as fruits and those sort of things. Glucose is going to be what we find in most sugar-based products. It's the base component of table sugar. As far as our guts can handle about 60 grams per hour of glucose and about 30 grams per hour of fructose. And these are averages, right? So some people can tolerate more or less given the scenario.
Yep.
And fructose in itself is also can be very unique. So fructose has a higher osmolality, so it can actually bring water into the GI system quite quickly, and could also cause some GI issues. So with the big, I think, popularization in trying to eat clean foods, so some people would result on things like dates for fueling. because the primary sugar is going to be in there is fructose, it could cause this sense of like bringing too much water into the gut, causing some GI distress. So, types of carbohydrates I find tend to be another area of concern. And then the last one I would say would be electrolytes. I think electrolytes have been really hyped up over the past few years. And um, I have my personal opinions about electrolytes. I don't think we need to be replenishing them at the rate that we are seeing some athletes. I saw a triathlete, elite triathlete. He had posted that he was consuming like 3,000 milligrams of sodium an hour because that's what his sweat rate test said he lost per hour. And I'm just like, that's a recipe for disaster for like for heart problems for one. But too many electrolytes can also cause GI distress. And I'm actually seeing that more and more because there is this big push for electrolytes. And then also electrolytes are in a lot of the gels that we see as well. So you're having the electrolyte plus them in the gel, and it's just, again, too much for the GI system to handle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even with electrolytes, we do forget that we can get them from food as well. Yeah. Putting a little salt on your meals and then eating magnesium, potassium we get from a lot of plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grains. So, I mean, being mindful of like those foods around your running, but you know, getting them on a daily basis, we can, you know, replace them, and we don't have to be taking, not everyone has to be taking an electrolyte supplement, but that's another topic for another day. Yeah, back to the carb fueling. So you said that range of like 30 to 60 grams per hour up to hours, like 4 events, or if you're running 4 events, 4 hours or longer, sorry. And then trying to stick to the lower end when you're just getting used to that. So that gets into the like gut training. So we talk about training like our mind and then our physical body for, you know, marathon or half marathon, which is quite a big feat. But we also want to make sure that we're training our gut to take in those carbohydrates. Because I believe the science is that we only have so many carbohydrate transporters in our gut, but by practicing taking in carbs during like our training sessions, we can actually increase those number of carbohydrate receptors and then be able to tolerate more generally. So I guess, do you like have a number of sort of long runs you recommend clients like train with, you know, at the 30 gram mark before working up, or what's sort of your way to get them to increase?
I think it depends on the sensitivity of the athlete. Most of the time, individuals know if they have a sensitive stomach or not. So, you know, if someone's like never really had a problem, they can eat something, go out for a run. Then we may go ahead and start off like, hey, have a gel at the 20 to 30-minute mark, see how you feel and go for it. Again, that's kind of gauging the athlete if they can well tolerate it. Now, if you have a lot more sensitive gut, what we do is we start off by having a very small bolus of carbohydrates kind of as you're walking out the door, right? So this could be a half a gel, it could be an applesauce, maybe even like a single bite of a banana is a strategy I had to use with a client that was extremely sensitive, right? So starting in that really small range. And so once you can tolerate something kind of as you're heading out the door, it's like, okay, now can we translate this during the run? So as you're running, you start to slowly reduce how much blood flow you have to the gut. So early on in the run, you have a lot more blood flow, but as we're kind of progressing in our runs, that blood flow starts to reduce, and that's where we can start to see an increased risk of GI symptoms. So we may play around with having a little bit more food earlier on. So again, closer to that 20 to 30-minute mark is when I like to start fueling, rather than sometimes you see, I know on the gel packets, they will recommend at the 45-minute mark. And in my opinion, that's a little bit too late because we do want to preserve that carbohydrates in the muscle as much as possible. So in order to do that, we need to fuel a little bit earlier. And then from there, we can start working our way up. And so again, depending on the sensitivity of the gut, we may do increases of about 10 grams per hour. Or it could be a little bit more aggressive of 15, 20, or 30 grams per hour. But the goal is each run, you're building up to that threshold you want to meet for your race. And so if the goal is 60 grams per hour, because you do plan on maybe, let's say, running at a Boston qualifying time, then you would likely want to give yourself probably a good 6 to 8 runs to practice and trial things out. And that gives some room for error. You may not need all 6 to 8 long runs to test it out, but it's a really good start.
Yeah, for sure. You don't want to just be trying that all out.
No,
Actually.
no. I get sometimes an influx of clients like right before like the Toronto Marathon or something, and they're like, "Hey, like I need to fuel for my race." And I'm like, "Oh, we're 2 weeks out. Cool." Um,
That's funny. Um, yeah, I guess going back to the minimizing the GI issues and like the carb types,
mhm,
because I see a lot of clients with IBS or IBS type symptoms, and then
mhm.
quite a few of them are like runners or endurance athletes, so they do have very sensitive guts. So I tend to use
Yeah.
like the concept of, even for some of them that are not doing like the low FODMAP elimination, but I tend to use low FODMAP carbs around
Mhm.
runs, and then for intra-workout fueling. I guess, is that something that you use at all in your practice, like the concept of low FODMAP? I think it's becoming a little bit more like used in the endurance sports nutrition space, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think it depends on the severity and kind of like how much work I've done with the client beforehand. So if someone does have GI issues, I my approach to FODMAPs tends to be a little bit more modified. So I won't typically do a full FODMAP diet. And I actually saw that was it a GI physician statement? I forget whose physician statement it was, but they are less and less recommending like a full elimination diet of FODMAPs, but rather trying to find which FODMAPs are kind of the issue. So if we're able to identify those beforehand, then absolutely we would try to minimize those around kind of those running periods, just to minimize any sort of potential risk. A lot of times that does put a client at ease as well, because no one wants to have GI issues while they run. Um, there's sometimes nervousness. I've also had clients that have accidents during runs as well. So
Mhm.
we can minimize that risk. Sometimes we will reduce any sort of potential trigger foods around those running periods.
Yeah, so it sort of depends on what their history is and
Okay.
as well. Yeah,
Yes.
I had some with quite like severe um, events during runs, so it tends to be a little.
Yeah. I think for severe IBS or GI conditions, I tend to refer out.
Case, yeah, the low
Yeah.
FODMAP, the whole thing of
Yeah.
it can be quite
Yes.
complex too.
It is.
Um, and then yeah, you mentioned being cautious around like I guess the real foods during running. I know like because gels can be expensive, like they do. The
Hmm.
cost does add up. I personally do sometimes recommend like you can try doing like real foods like medjool dates or even pitted dates are actually lower FODMAP in certain quantities. Banana.
Yeah.
I have a couple clients that make their own like oat-based carby bars, really low fat,
Hmm.
low protein, and then sort of mix that in with gels just for more like I guess a budget friendly perspective too. Is that something that you recommend, or do you have clients just stick with gels, or what are your thoughts?
No, I love the combination of both. I think I'm on board. Like the cost of gels, I think has rapidly increased with the increase in runners and just the culture in itself. Um, I will call out more teams. I think their gels are like $5 a gel or
Yeah.
something crazy. And that's a bit much. So if you're doing a long run and you need 4 gels, that's $20. Like, that's a bit much. So, um, I always ask the client, like, do you have a preference? I do have some clients that are just like, hey, I just want to carry my gels. I don't really want to have whole foods. Some others are open to it and they want to have whole foods anyway. So I always put the client's preferences first. Um, and there's no right or wrong. So we can get away with whole foods, and whole foods can be just as functional. I think when it comes to carbohydrate gels, two things come to mind. One, they're just easier to carry and have on hand. And then two is that most of your gels nowadays are formulated to kind of have a nice ratio of fructose and glucose for digestibility, right? So there are pros to that, but again, cons would be that cost uh, cost effectiveness of gels. So
Yeah.
I do use also things like honey and maple syrup. They also make reusable pouches now, which I think is phenomenal that you can buy so that you can make your own gels at home.
Oh, that's cool. Oh, nice.
Yeah. You can buy them on Amazon. I first saw them at Endurance Tap. So they're a maple syrup gel company. They kind of have it where you can buy like a bulk container of their gel and just refill the container. So it's a little bit cost saving. And you also, they did it for not using so much waste for the plastic pieces. But then I started to see some now on Amazon, which are just like little plastic containers that you can reuse and refill.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, maple syrup is another one. I tend to stick away from honey. My understanding was that it was more fructose based, just because I work with the low FODMAP diet a lot. So honey
Yeah.
becomes high fructose, like above a teaspoon. So I'm a little cautious around
Mhm.
that. But maple syrup is more glucose dominant. So I think that one's
Yeah.
and yeah, that one it's easy. I mean, maple syrup is, if you get good quality, it's a little more expensive, but it'll last a while if you're making your own gels and stuff compared to buying the gels. So that's good. I'll have to look
Mhm.
at homemade.
Yeah.
You can find some recipes too.
Mhm.
And then let's talk about carb loading.
Mm.
So, yeah, why don't you explain what carb loading is? Is it beneficial for every runner? And then what would sort of be the general guidelines that you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I love carb loading. I think it's a fantastic concept. And when we take a look at the research, we can see anywhere between a 7 to 14% improvement in performance, even in kind of like that elite athlete population where, 2% performance is like fantastic. So the degree of impact that we see from carb loading is so beneficial, right? And carb loading is going to make sure those carbohydrate stores in the muscle are kind of at their maximum capacity. So if we kind of think about someone's training routine, most of the time marathon runners are running anywhere between 4 to 7 times per week. So the capacity to run at full glycogen or stored carbohydrate is really hard to do unless you're eating a lot of food on a very regular and consistent basis, specifically carbohydrates. It's just physiologically just very hard to keep really 100% stored carbohydrates at their capacity in the muscle. So when we're kind of hitting into that taper week for right before a race, volume tends to be low. You may go for a shakeout run, very low volume. This is a really good time to make sure that we're maximizing those carbohydrate stores. And then so what you'll start to see is I most commonly will do a 2 day. So you need at least 24 hours. So it takes about 24 hours for that whole process of like taking in carbohydrates, digesting, and putting it into the muscle tissue. But 2 days is what we typically need for the amount of carbohydrates to maximize the muscle glycogen or carbohydrates. Um, some people need upwards of 3 if they have a lot of muscle mass, right? So kind of will depend on the person's body size at that point. But then we focus on increasing carbohydrates for those 2 to 3 days leading up into the race. When I say increasing carbohydrates, I always like to emphasize this is not cookies and pizzas and things like that, but it's, what we call naked carbohydrate. So those carbohydrates that don't necessarily have a fat component added to them. So we're thinking of white rice, pretzels, fruits, granola bars, noodles, those very simple carbohydrates where we can add fats and proteins to them, but we don't want to overconsume fats and proteins kind of in those days leading up to the race.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And would that apply for, like, do you have the same recommendations for a half marathon versus a marathon, or?
Yes. So our general recommendation for carb loading is 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for those 2, maybe upwards of 3 days. Um, for a half, because the duration is shorter, we don't necessarily need as many stored carbohydrates. So you could actually just get away with probably increasing your carbohydrate intake closer to that 6 to 8 gram per kilogram mark. Because if we think about it, a marathon or half marathons lasting between some people who are super fast, 90 minutes upwards to, 2.5, 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if we're taking in some fueling kind of around that race or that running period, then we tend to do a pretty good job. Now, if you want to maximize it, increasing those carbohydrate sources can be beneficial. But now when we head into that marathon distance, so if you plan to run at a very high intensity, or if you plan to run it even in 3 to 4 hours, that kind of goes into an extended period of time where we need to make sure those glycogen or stored carbohydrates in the muscle are at their peak, so that you don't hit a wall, which we commonly see, between mile 18 and 22.
Mm-hmm. Or that bonking.
Yeah.
Okay. And when it comes to, I guess, preventing like digestive issues, I know there's been,
Yes.
Complaints of feeling bloated, nauseous, maybe, not feeling great during that carb load. What tips do you usually suggest to help like prevent that?
Yeah. I think first thing to kind of comprehend is that when we are in our training period, we likely should be eating 6 to 8 grams per kilogram per day of carbohydrate anyways. And I do find day-to-day nutrition, most people are not quite hitting that or kind of practice that to a certain extent. So I think step one is that when you are in your half to full marathon prep, you are starting to kind of increase that carbohydrate intake there so that your gut can get used to that volume of carbohydrate. Right.
Mhm.
But as we're heading into the actual carbohydrate loading piece, we want to keep foods consistent. So anything that you typically have on a regular basis, I want you to introduce those here as well. We don't want to try new foods because that's where we can increase the risk of GI upset.
Mm.
Um, Keeping fiber lower. So again, this is a time where you don't want to have a high fiber diet. You don't want to opt for those whole grains. This is where we want to keep it simple. So again, white rice, white potatoes, rice noodles are one of my favorites. I think they're fantastic and really easy digestible.
Mhm.
And some people because the volume of carbohydrates is so much, there is likely to be some distension of the stomach. And we associate that with bloating. And I like to explain to my clients that that's not necessarily bad, right? We're having an increased volume of food into the stomach. So it is going to be natural. We're going to have a little bit more distension of the stomach. But what's going to be really key here is that making sure you're having enough hydration in the process, right?
Mhm.
So in order for us to take those carbohydrates and put them in the muscle, it requires a certain amount of water. So I think it's like 3 grams of water per gram of carbohydrates you store. So if you're not having enough fluid, we can kind of see maybe some stagnation in the digestion process and not putting the carbohydrates where they need to necessarily. So making sure you're well hydrated throughout this process is also a mistake I see quite often.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess even thinking about the electrolytes as well,
Mhm.
because you do need those to absorb fluids. I think it's also why it's important to remember, like, if you are, maybe have done carb loading on your own, or intra-workout fueling
Right.
and, struggled with these issues, it can be helpful to work with a dietitian because it can
Yeah.
be personalized. There are like a lot of different recommendations online.
Mhm.
I think even in the sports nutrition papers, there's differences in like recommendations.
Yeah.
So it can be like important to have it tailored to you. I know I see like for clients who maybe habitually they eat a little bit lower carb intake, going up to that 8 to 12 range would just be way
Mhm.
too much for the carb load, and
Yes.
they can still keep to within the 6 to 8 gram ratio for their marathon and still feel really good and perform well. Just
Mhm.
they usually adapt to. And then even for the fiber intake, like if someone is used to eating a very high fiber diet, we don't
Yeah.
want to drop it so low close to the race because then that can result in constipation. So it's a little
Mhm.
bit of fine tuning sort of based on what you usually do, how you usually fuel your body, your size. That can impact that too. So always,
Yeah.
yeah, reach out to a
Yes.
dietitian for
It's
selection.
always like the nuances of like recommendation versus application, right? I always explain that to people like, oh yes, we have these guidelines, and I think these guidelines tell us like what's typically best, but doesn't mean you absolutely have to meet that. I think a really great example of that is if you have a client that has extra adiposity or extra fat tissue, you may not want to also do the 8 to 12 grams per kilogram. I think the running culture has been fantastic. It's welcoming for everyone of all different fitness levels. So if you are coming in and you're doing a half or full marathon, um, for example, I had a client, she was um, had a higher body fat percentage. And so when we do the math on that, the grams of carbohydrates, that's a lot of carbohydrate. But if we recall, our goal is to maximize the carbohydrates in our muscle tissue, right? And so if you can make adjustment based off of muscle tissue rather than total body weight, that's also a really good consideration as well.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Even plays a role in like protein recommendations
Yeah,
that are really high body weight. It yeah, gets a little messy if we're using grams per kilogram because it can
it
be
does. Yeah.
yeah, that's a good point. I guess just yeah, final thoughts here. What advice would you have for someone training either for their first half or full marathon around proper fueling and carb loading? I guess just like your key takeaways. What would you say?
Yeah. Um, I'm a real big proponent of simplicity. Like I know we talk about, these numbers in grams per hour and things like that. So just keep it simple for yourself. So because we say these numbers and these recommendations doesn't mean you have to track or count anything, but rather, think about, are you eating something before your run, right? Are you eating something after your run? How's the rest of your nutrition looking like, right? So starting in these small, again, little buckets where you can make a big impact without overwhelming yourself, I think is one of the really biggest things because there's a lot of nutrition information online, even just running information as you're starting to get into it. So keep it simple as much as possible, just to ease the mind a bit throughout this process.
And it can be helpful to find that balance. Like part of it's good to have those external guidelines and maybe using that objective data, try tracking, just seeing how much you're getting,
Yeah.
but it's also important too to listen to how your body's feeling. How are you feeling during your runs? Are you recovering well? Are you not getting sick all the time? Are you able to increase your mileage? Are you getting injured? All of those things are important too to kind of look at and give you a picture or properly feeling like on a daily basis, as you said, and then also, properly setting yourself up for your runs and feeling well during them.
Yeah, absolutely.
One last thing here, I guess. Would you say is it normal or is it a myth what would you say to someone who says they have to take like a nap or they crash after a long run? Is that a normal thing or something we want to be aware of?
I put it more so in the bucket of not being a normal thing, especially if it is coming at such an intensity where you can't go through the rest of your day unless you have that nap. I think there are certain exceptions of very high volume athletes that, if they're hitting, 80 miles per week, that take a nap, right? But, if you are hitting 20 to 25, you slowly increase where you've needed to, then having that nap right afterwards is probably a good sign that you're not having enough fuel. And it's not that you're not even having enough fuel during that long run, but also how prepared were you before that run? So kind of going back to that day-to-day nutrition, which can be hugely impactful. Because I've had clients that their pre and post-workout nutrition was beautiful, but kind of outside of that, they were under eating or under fueling, kind of resulting in this chronic or day-to-day style deficit that resulted in low energy levels.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, for I guess runners training really high mileage, then they may, benefit from a nap just to get a bit of extra hours of sleep. But for those of us more around that moderate level, may not be a good thing that you're needing to take a nap after. So good sign. Better. Cool. Any final thoughts or anything else you'd like to add or share? The context of this discussion, or did we cover it all?
No, I think covered the basis. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, for anyone watching, if you did have any questions, I guess you can post them below and we can get back to you. And how can people find you, contact you, get in touch with you, Stephanie?
Yeah. I've tried the social media thing. That's a little bit of a challenge. You can reach me through social media of Instagram, or I have a contact space on my website along with my email. So I'm happy for questions or anything like that to come through there as well.
Awesome. And do you have any resources, anything people can grab to get some tips or learn a bit more about you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a fueling guide that you can get access to. And so I kind of break down like the basics of nutrition. Is a great option to start, I think. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. We will link to that below as well. Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much, Stephanie. It's been a very, very interesting chat today. And I hope for whoever's listening, there were some light bulb moments and some good takeaways, because running is fun, and making sure that we're feeling properly makes it even more fun. So
absolutely.
Good takeaways. All right.
Yes. Thank you.